Hi, and welcome to the Blackberries in High Tunnels and Protected Structures Virtual Field Tour. This is the fourth production in the Soil and Water Conservation Virtual Field Trip Series, hosted by the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. I want to thank the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service for funding this project. My name is Amanda McWhort. I'm an Associate Professor of Horticulture and Extension Specialist with the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. And today I'm joined by Dr. Aaron Cato and Tanya Ernst. Thanks so much for being here, guys.
Yeah, happy to help out.
Yeah. So Aaron, do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm actually an associate professor in the horticulture department. I work with fruits and vegetables, and I do pest management. So I help growers lose less and less money, be more profitable when they're dealing with diseases and insects. So I'm an entomologist, so insects are where I primarily work with, but I work with diseases as well.
Great. And what about you, Tanya?
I'm the high tunnel instructor for the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture. So I work with growers all around the state who are either interested in getting into high tunnel production or who are currently using high tunnels to grow food.
Great. So we got a great panel of experts today who are very well versed in growing fruits and vegetables across the state of Arkansas. And so you'll get to hear more from each one of us as we dive into this virtual field tour of high tunnels and shade structures for blackberries. Before we get started today, I do want to thank all of you for joining us and give you some tips on how you can interact with us here in the studio. So those of you that are joining us live, please feel free to submit any questions throughout today's presentation in the Q&A chat function at the bottom of that screen. And so if you go down there and you have any questions at any time, just enter them there, and then we will try and get to as many of those questions as we're able to at the end of the presentation. But let's go ahead and dive in. Today we're going to be touring the Arkansas Berry Company, which is our largest blackberry farm in Arkansas. It's located in Judsonia, Arkansas, and the farm has been a Discovery Farm site since 2023. The focus of this Discovery Farm is evaluating protected agricultural structures like high tunnels and shade, which of course is our topic of the day. And these structures are kind of unique because they provide the crop with protection from extreme weather events, things like heavy rainfall, very hot temperatures, and possibly even hail. But to get things kicked off, let's go hear more about the farm, and our tour guide of the farm today will be Matt Wilson.
I am Matt Wilson, director of the Judsonia Arkansas Berry Company, Judsonia location. You can see behind me a lot of blackberries. We have a 145-acre blackberry farm, commercial production. We pack our blackberries and ship to local and regional grocery stores all over the country. We grow primarily University of Arkansas blackberry varieties, bred right here in the state of Arkansas. I'm also president of the Arkansas Blackberry Growers Association, an association in the state for increasing education and networking opportunities for growers and individuals interested in being blackberry growers. The farm is always looking for more innovative ways to be better at what we do. We had an interest in determining if shade, like in other parts of the world, would improve market quality and shippability of our berries. And so we had an interest in partnering with the University of Arkansas on shade structures like tunnels, and then also just a shade net to reduce UV exposure to the blackberry. So we've actually had the high tunnel behind us. So this will be our third year to look at data and the high tunnel structure, and we also have a shade structure, 5 acres of shade, the 1 acre tunnel behind me. The farm is a 220-acre farm. We have 10 acres of muscadines, 3 acres of blueberries, and 145 acres of blackberries, with blackberry being our largest crop. That's our primary focus here. We are 100% surface water irrigated on all those acres, which is unique to most agriculture operations. In the blackberries, we have about 9 different varieties of blackberries to create a season spread, make our season last longer. If we just had one variety, it would be a 2 or 3 week season and it would be over. And because blackberry is such a labor-intensive crop, it takes a lot of people to harvest an acre of blackberries, so we use the H2A program, and the cost of getting workers here and getting the crop harvested, to spread the cost, we try to make our season last a little bit longer than just what one variety would give us. The H-2A program is a federal labor program that allowed work visas to be granted to individuals in other countries to come in and serve in an ag labor shortage in areas of the country where you can't find local labor. This allowed us the opportunity to be able to source labor from places like Mexico to come and help us harvest our crops. Yeah, to put 145 acres in perspective, we're talking about 1.5 million pounds of blackberries is our annual average on harvest for blackberries. Not every blackberry makes it into a clamshell, so a large part of that can be for secondary markets for juice or jelly. But for the most part, it's 1 million to 1.5 million pounds going in clamshells and being shipped to local grocery stores and regional grocery stores as well. So working with the university and the Discovery Farm, and also in collaboration with the Arkansas Blackberry Growers Association, we've been able to provide information back to other growers through our field days. We had a field day hosted here at this farm in April, and a field day in Clarksville as well at the fruit breeding experiment station. And so we've been able to help educate others on what we're learning here. Using surface water for irrigation is unique because we're collecting rainwater and reusing it on our crops. We don't have an abundance of water table here, so to drill a well, we're not using water from an aquifer. What limited aquifer is here, so we're not tapping into that. We're using rainwater to irrigate the crops. With the surface water irrigation, we're using 100% drip irrigation. It's laid under our fabric in the bed where the roots of the plant are, so the water is getting directly to the roots of the plant. It's not overhead irrigation, and so we're getting a very effective use of that water, no waste. The water being applied through the drip and below our weed barrier fabric provides some food safety protection. The water's not coming in contact with the fruit that a consumer will eat. It's also conserving water that is not being applied aerial or over the top. There's no waste. It is directly in the root zone. The partnerships with all the parties involved have been extremely helpful with our extension specialists and the others that have been out here looking at crops and evaluating the shade and everything that we've got going on is a lot to look at, and so every extra set of eyes really helps, and it adds value to the farm. It makes us more profitable in farming.
Thanks to Matt Wilson for sharing all those insights and background information on the farm. I think it's really helpful. This farm is really unique in the state of Arkansas just due to its very large size and the fact that they're shipping a lot of their fruit, and that really impacts how they have to think about decisions that they make on the farm.
Yeah, they're incredibly interested in improving efficiencies by looking at research, and so we've benefited a lot from doing a lot of research trials with them. That data has been shared with the entire region and the entire nation. So it's really good that we're able to collaborate with them.
Yeah, it's great to have them as a discovery farm. So now that we know a little bit about the farm, let's move on and talk a little bit more about what high tunnels and shade structures are and the benefits and maybe potential drawbacks. And so we're going to go next to Tanya. And so Tanya, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your role and your position here with the University of Arkansas?
Yeah, so I've been working with the university in this position for a little over 2 years now. And I work with growers all around the state and growers, specifically high tunnel growers all throughout the state, and all of them have varying degrees of experience with high tunnels. So I've worked with growers who are just thinking about getting into it and trying to think through that process, all the way up to very experienced growers who are just trying to dial in and tune up their facilities and structures.
And I'm sure growers all across the state are grateful to have you as a resource to ask questions of and to get feedback. So
I hope so.
I think so. Tanya's a great resource. If you're here in the state of Arkansas, make sure you reach out to her. But let's go back out to the field now and see a little bit of Tanya's recommendations about the benefits of shade structures and high tunnels.
Hi, I'm Tanya. I'm going to talk about high tunnels in general today and a little bit about how high tunnels have been adapted to Arkansas and using them for blackberry production. So in their simplest and most basic form, a high tunnel is a plastic covered structure that uses passive or manual manipulation to control its internal environment. For example, on a bright sunny day, if you were to close up a tunnel, which means you close doors, vents, sidewalls, any type of opening, you can be as much as 30 degrees or more warmer inside of your high tunnel than you are outside of your tunnel. So this allows high tunnel growers to plant earlier in the year, extend their harvest later into the fall, and even plant cool, hardy crops throughout the winter months. While high tunnels are generally used for their cost-effective method of extending growing seasons, they also protect plants from other environmental stressors such as rain, hail, or even high winds. High tunnels come in a variety of sizes and shapes. One thing that we're learning as we're adapting these structures to our warmer climate here in Arkansas is that your size and type of tunnel does make a difference on how successful that high tunnel production is. So if you're thinking about getting a high tunnel, take some time to look up and understand how those shapes and sizes can affect your ability to control that climate inside. The benefits of high tunnel production have been well documented and well researched. So some of the most common benefits we've already kind of discussed a little bit. So first, its ability to cheaply or more cost effectively extend a growing season, which is definitely probably what most growers are looking at when they're getting into high tunnel production. But there have been research studies that have shown that plants or crops grown inside of a high tunnel have higher quality and higher yields. It also allows growers to extend their revenue periods because they can grow outside of the season. They can extend when they're harvesting, when they're selling, and therefore extend their revenue periods. And when they're selling out of season production, so when you're doing those early season tomato crops, they can usually get a higher premium price for them during those early markets. So high tunnels do have a lot of benefits. So a shade structure is kind of a reverse high tunnel, whereas the high tunnels you're trying to increase your temperature mostly throughout the year so you can extend your harvest season. A shade structure is trying to do the opposite. It's trying to lower those temperatures so you can cool your plant's environment, which is a big issue here in Arkansas where we tend to be pretty warm. Shade structures can look similar to a high tunnel. Some people will use a high tunnel structure, remove that plastic and put a shade cloth over the top, or they'll put a shade cloth directly over that plastic to try and cool it down. So they can still get the benefit of rain exclusion with the plastic cover, but use that shade cloth to reduce that temperature. So shade cloth can come in the degree of shade that it supplies, as well as different colors. It comes in different colors. And the color and the degree of shade each offer different benefits. So depending on what kind of crop you're planning on growing, should help dictate what kind of shade cloth you're going to use and whether or not you're going to use it over the top of your plastic or just use it as a shade structure in general. So most high tunnels that you're going to see are usually span about 20 to 30 feet in a single bay. The tunnels behind me, as you can see, are multi-bays. Each bay is connected by a single or shared gutter system as well as sidewall. So while multi-bay tunnels are a more cost-effective way of covering large areas of ground, they do pose some additional management issues that a single bay tunnel will not. For starters, they usually have they can pose more airflow issues inside, so usually there's a little bit more management going into making sure you get your airflow in there. They don't seal as well, so they're not as useful for season extension as a single bay tunnel will be. So most people who put these structures in tend to use them more as either a 3-season or like what they're doing here at Arkansas Berry Company. They're using them mostly for rain exclusion during key times of the year. So one of the challenges that we have faced trying to adapt these high tunnel structures to our longer summers and more hot, humid climates here in Arkansas is how to use them to maximize all the benefits that they can give to a grower. So the tunnels here at Arkansas Berry Company are being used a little differently than what a standard high tunnel is used for. So blackberries grown here in Arkansas face a few environmental limitations. And they wanted to use these structures to try and minimize those limitations without putting in a lot of additional costs. So the way these tunnels are working, they're not worried about a season extension here. They're just worried about protecting their developing fruit from some of these environmental stresses. So what they do here is during the off season, when the berries are not producing, they actually remove the plastic off of these tunnels. And then in the early spring, when the berries start to develop, they will come and pull that plastic over the top of those tunnels. And then they protect that fruit from rainfall, from wind, hail, whatever environmental stress might hit it, that plastic can protect them from. And then once harvest is over, they'll come through and they'll remove that plastic again and allow the plants to just be exposed to regular environmental conditions. Now, because heat is always an issue here in Arkansas, they went a step further. So most high tunnels are covered with a clear 6 mil greenhouse grade plastic that allows ample sunlight to come through so it can really warm up its environment during the off season. But what they did here is they're using a white 6 mil greenhouse grade plastic, which is more of an opaque plastic. So it kind of blocks some of that sunlight and acts a little bit like a shade cloth. Instead of warming up its environment, it can actually help cool it a little bit as well as reduce some of that light. So in addition to protecting these plants from like rainfall or hail, it can also help protect these plants from sun-related issues or heat-related issues by helping it cool as well. While high tunnels and shade structures do offer a lot of benefits for growers, particularly for some blackberry growers, there are some trade-offs involved. So there is additional cost associated with just building the structures themselves, and then of course maintaining them. So like we talked about, for this particular high tunnel that's behind me, they actually uncover and cover this every year, and that takes some time. They allowed me to come up while they were covering this tunnel this last year, and it took about 6 to 8 people about 40 to 45 minutes to do a single bay. So there's some time management that goes into this. So just the cost of constructing the structure as well as managing and maintaining the structure is additional for both of these structures. And high tunnels in general, single bay tunnels specifically, we've noticed that because we're creating all these really nice environments inside these structures for our crops, we're also creating really nice environments for insects and other pests. So we often see higher insect and pest pressures inside tunnels compared to nearby field production. So when you're moving production inside of a tunnel, that's something to always be in mind of. So the popularity of high tunnels has been increasing quite quickly here in Arkansas. So we're just scratching the surface on what these structures can offer to high tunnel growers. And it'll be interesting and exciting to see how other growers adapt these structures and just how well these structures might work to protect some of our high value crops from our high pressure climate that we are trying to grow in.
Tanya, thanks so much for that background info. I think it's really helpful to lay the groundwork of understanding why we use tunnels and shade structures. So you really set us up to be able to learn more about using these in blackberries.
Yeah, and I really appreciate introducing the idea of potential issues that someone may encounter, like diseases or other types of pests, in the conversation of getting a tunnel. Because I think a lot of times it's really rosy online, like, look how nice this would be. It's like, yes, but there are complications.
Right, it's not just straightforward. There's a lot of things to consider, and
Yeah.
you know, especially with new growers, there's a lot of things to learn as well. And so you have done a great job of developing resources to help new growers who are interested in adopting high tunnels. And so, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of those resources that are available?
Yes, so the one I wanted to mention specifically, this is a high tunnel production guide for the state of Arkansas and for the Southeast. It'll work throughout the Southeast. We've been working on this for a while, and it came out within the last couple months. It's a really great resource, I think, for anybody, whether you're an experienced high tunnel grower or just thinking about maybe getting a tunnel. So we start from the very beginning. So the first couple chapters are like here's some questions to ask yourself, like, should I even be considering getting a high tunnel, all the way up to like selecting a good location for the high tunnel, because if you pick a bad location, you're just going to struggle until you either give up or move that tunnel. So, and then we go all the way up to people who might be a little bit more experienced. So talking about like pest management control in the tunnel, good climate management practices, just trying to cover every topic that we could think of that would help make high tunnel production successful here in the state. So the High Tunnel Production Guide, it is a free downloadable resource available online, or you can even order a hard copy if you prefer having the paper copy, which I do. So you can get both of those online. We also have a high tunnel website that we have started up, and it's through this website that we we will announce like any events or other resources that have become available. So you can visit that website, sign up for our email contact group, so that if you want to know what's going on throughout the state high tunnel wise, we're pretty good at keeping people updated on that.
No, those are both great resources. We'll make sure and have the links to the website and the production guide in the chat. So if you want to check those out, you can find them there. I want to commend you on the High Tunnel Production Guide. It's very comprehensive. I've heard many growers say they wish they had such a guide when they were getting started. So if you're interested in getting started in high tunnels, definitely check that out.
Yes.
The other thing that we hear often from growers who are just getting started is, there's a big cost in getting a high tunnel installed to buy the structure.
Getting more expensive every year.
And it's getting more expensive, just like everything else, it's getting more expensive every year. But the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, is a federal program that supports growers to adopt conservation practices on their farm. And one of those conservation practices that they support is high tunnels. And so can you tell us a little bit more about your experience? Obviously, you don't work for NRCS, but you've worked with a lot of growers who have used that program. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I think it's a really great program, because one of the biggest hurdles for growers who are interested in high tunnels is the cost of purchasing that structure, that initial cost. So what the NRCS does through their EQIP program is they will help cover that initial cost. So they don't cover the full cost. It's a percentage of the cost, but you apply for it, and if you are awarded it, then they will help you cover that initial cost. So again, I don't work for NRCS, but I've worked with a lot of growers who have gone through that process. And so a couple of the things that I'm hearing as they've gone through this process is, one, make sure you're patient with the process. It is an application process, so you can submit an application anytime throughout the year. But from what I understand, there's only one time that it's actually awarded, and not everybody who applies gets a high tunnel. And not everybody who applies the first time gets a high tunnel. So be patient. Submit that application. Make sure you follow up with your NRCS county office to see where your application fits and is in that process. If you're not awarded the first year, don't give up. Continue to apply for that. And again, just emphasize, like, this is they're not going to cover the full cost. It is a cost share program, but it's helped a lot of growers get started. So it's a really good program. Again, I don't work for them, so I would recommend, if you have more questions about NRCS EQIP programs, particularly the high tunnel one, contact your local NRCS office. They're going to be able to answer all those questions.
Yep, that's a great tip. Encourage growers to reach out to NRCS for more information. And of course, if you have questions for us here in the studio, you can enter those into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we will try and get to those at the end of the presentation. But now that we have talked a little bit about the farm and a little bit about high tunnels and shade structures, let's dive in and talk a little bit about some of the research and observations that we have collected through this Discovery Farm site. In particular, looking at the impacts of high tunnels and shade structures on fruit quality, which, as we mentioned, this farm is very large, it's shipping fruit, and so fruit quality is going to be paramount to their success. So let's head back out to the farm, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of our research. So our collaboration with Arkansas Berry Company for the Discovery Farm started in 2023. And our initial interest in collaborating with the largest blackberry farm in Arkansas was to evaluate some of these conservation practices that could help improve crop production. And with specialty crops, one of our biggest concerns is usually the quality of the product. Most of our specialty crops, and those would be things like tomatoes, blackberries, strawberries, etc., are harvested fresh and eaten fresh, and so the quality has to be really top-notch because that product is going to be harvested and then moved to a local market. And that quality needs to be excellent coming out of the field so that by the time it gets to the consumer, that quality is still really high. And so with blackberries, we have some concerns of how our environment or our rainfall or temperatures can impact crop quality. And so one of the things that we wanted to look at with the Arkansas Berry Company was looking at these tunnels and shade structures because they modify the environment around the plants that then can impact fruit quality. Specifically with the tunnel structure that you see here and our shade structure that we'll show you across the road, we were interested in how these structures can impact the temperature around the plants, the moisture on the leaves, so the leaf wetness, looking at how the structures can also impact UV light because the two structures actually block a certain amount of sunlight. And then thinking about how those factors together can impact fruit quality. Because some of the issues that we can have with blackberries as they're starting to ripen is that the fruit, as it goes from a green stage to a red stage to a black stage, it becomes a lot softer and more prone to some of our fruit disorders. Notably, one of the ones that we struggle with the most in Arkansas is something called white droop. And white droop is just when a blackberry has some sunburn on it. And so it shows up as individual drooplets that turn white and eventually will actually turn tan. And so it reduces the marketable quality of the fruit because it doesn't look great, right? And so for a fresh eating blackberry, you want to see a fruit that is completely black or maybe has just a hint of red in it. And that whitening will actually make it so that even in a local market, the fruit would be unmarketable, but also for the shipping market, there's not a high tolerance for that in fruit that is shipped. And white droop we tend to see shows up when we have warm temperatures and there's rainfall followed by the sun coming out and being really bright. And if you think about our weather here in Arkansas in June and July when we're harvesting blackberries, we have a lot of times where the weather follows sort of that pattern where we maybe have a rainfall in the morning or the evening, the plants and the fruit can be a little bit wet, and then the sun comes out and it gets really hot. And basically what we see is that moisture in the air or on the plant kind of acts as a magnifying glass that then results in that sunburn on the fruit that we call white droop. And so by using these structures, the tunnel and the shade, where we are either removing some of that moisture from the air by blocking it or reducing some of the sunlight, the UV, with the shading, we were interested in if we could improve fruit quality. So what's kind of unique about this trial here is that this planting behind me was in place. So it was just a continuous rows of several different varieties of blackberry side by side. And then the tunnel was constructed over the back half of several of the rows. And so we're actually able to compare how the varieties perform outside of the tunnel versus inside of the tunnel on a planting that's the same age and a very similar soil structure across it. One thing to keep in mind about tunnels is that the plastic typically will last somewhere around 5 to 6 years and then it will have to be replaced. And so that is a recurring cost that growers need to be aware of. It's also a real labor-intensive process to put the plastic on. And I'll mention that we don't leave the plastic on year-round, so we only put the plastic up on top of the tunnel structure as the fruit starts to ripen. So as it starts to get some color to it, we'll put the plastic on and start to protect the fruit. And then once we're done with harvest, we'll take the plastic back off, so that way the plastic's not exposed to the UV light, which can degrade it, and it's also not exposed to if we had a hailstorm or something like that that might damage it. So we really use the plastic only for the time of fruit production, which is generally somewhere in mid-May through late July or so, where the plastic is on the crop. What we have done here with our Discovery Farm collaboration is we have put out temperature sensors both inside of the tunnel, inside of the shade, and then also outdoors in the general field production. We've also put out leaf moisture or leaf wetness sensors just to monitor, inside of a tunnel, are we having shorter periods where the leaves are wet? Because leaf wetness can also inhibit growers from getting into the field and picking because they don't want the fruit to be wet when they're picking it because that will degrade the quality. And then we've also done some measurements where we've gone in and just measured the UV under the tunnel in the shade to kind of gauge how much shading effect are we having. And then we've taken all of that data along with some observations of what is the fruit quality inside of a tunnel or inside of the shade versus out in the field, where we've actually gone through and done ratings of how much white druplet do we see. And then working with the grower has been really great. Matt and his team do a really good job of keeping a lot of data on yield, and so we have that data as well as far as how much yield are we getting in the tunnel versus out in the field versus in the shade structure. And so we've been collecting all of this data now for about 2 years, and we have some preliminary results. We haven't finalized all of our data collection for the 2025 season, but when we reflect back for the 2024 season, we got some interesting results. And so I'm going to kind of break those down based off of the different data points that we've been collecting. So if we look first at temperature, I want to talk a little bit about how much shading we know is in the tunnel versus in the shade structure. So the plastic that's on that tunnel is somewhere around about 35% shade versus the shade structure is providing about 25% shade. So we would expect that there might be a slight temperature difference inside the shade structure than the tunnel than outside, just because those differences in shade that it is providing. And basically what we see in our data is that there is a slight temperature reduction in the tunnel and in the shade compared to outside, but that temperature change is relatively small. And a lot of that may relate back to the types of structures that we are evaluating, where they're very open. They're really 3-season type tunnels or structures where, there's a lot of air movement, and so the temperature is not affected that much between the different structures, but there is a slight reduction in temperature. However, when we look at leaf wetness, we do see a really big difference, particularly in the tunnel, because the tunnel has a full plastic roof on it, so it's completely blocking rainfall from entering. We calculate leaf wetness in cumulative hours, so how many hours are leaves wet. And during the period where we were collecting data, we saw about 300 hours of leaf wetness out in the field versus about 150 hours of leaf wetness inside the tunnel. So the amount of leaf wetness was reduced by about 50%. And then the shade structure would be somewhere kind of in between those two, because it is reducing some moisture moving through, but it's a netted material, so it still allows some moisture through. Then finally, when we've gone through and done our UV measurements on a very bright sunny day, you can see a huge reduction in the amount of UV that is hitting the plants inside the tunnel and in the shade compared to outdoors. When we're standing out here today, it's a lot cloudier, and so the amount of UV reduction is going to be a lot smaller. And basically what we saw was when we combined all these factors together, a slight reduction in temperature, major reduction in leaf wetness, and a drastic reduction in UV, we did see that had an impact on some of our fruit quality disorders. So particularly with white drupe, and certain varieties will be more prone to getting white drupe than others. And when we've done our ratings, basically what we've seen is that particularly inside of the tunnel, where we have 35% shading, we can reduce white drupe by 50% or more when white drupe is really significant. So in periods where we have a lot of rainfall and really warm temperatures and white drupe can be a real problem, that tunnel can reduce white drupe by about 50%. On the shade structure, we saw something that was really interesting. It's only 25% shade again, and we have some varieties in the shade structure that are very prone to white drupe. So one of those is Apache, and it's well known because it's a later season variety. I think it has nice flavor, good production, but is very prone to getting that sunburn. Unfortunately, Apache in the shade structure in previous years, that slight reduction in UV was not enough to eliminate white drupe, and we still had pretty significant white drupe on that variety. So what we're seeing from these tools, these conservation practices, is that they can have a place in improving fruit quality, but growers really need to think about the cost of these types of measures and if they're going to pay off in the long term. And especially with increasing costs for all of our input materials, tunnels can be an expensive upfront cost. And for growers, there's a lot of different markets, and that will dictate the price of the fruit that they are getting. or the price that they get for their fruit. And in local markets, the price may be quite high versus a shipping market, the price can be a little bit lower. And so that may dictate whether or not it's an economically viable decision to use a tunnel. And so growers really gonna have to think about that and make some decisions about for their market and for their specific operation, if the benefits that you can see from a tunnel are worth it here in Arkansas.
That was excellent, Amanda. I really like this idea of fruit quality. Everybody thinks about what they're going to grow, and then there's some percent of that that's making it to someone who's going to buy it, right? And we always get questions about, well, this disease must be causing it, but almost, a lot of the times it's environmental, or there's some interplay between the two. So it's really good, I think, to discuss these things.
Yeah, and I love how you talk about the economic benefit of the tunnel, because I always tell people you can grow just about anything inside of this tunnel, but whether you can grow it economically, make a profit off it, is the bigger question. So this whole discussion on fruit quality and how these tunnels can be used to increase or improve fruit quality, these are things that growers really need to think about as they start expanding into high tunnel production. Don't just buy it because you want it. Is it really going to be a benefit to the crops you're growing and to the market that you are trying to zero in on?
Exactly, and I think that's one of the big things that through the Discovery Farm that we've really been trying to evaluate with this grower is, there's this huge upfront cost for the tunnel, and then we're seeing some benefits, but maybe we're also seeing some things that are a little problematic, and so it's not just immediate return on that investment. And so the grower really has to think long term if this is a technology that makes sense for their system and for their market, because of course, depending on how you're marketing your fruit, the price varies. And so that's part of the reason why we wanted to evaluate this with that grower.
Yeah. So, and I think a lot of people will be interested in the results, those economic results.
Absolutely. And of course, another consideration that we haven't gotten to yet is the impact of the tunnels and shade structures on pests and diseases. And so that's going to be our next topic, and we're going to go out to the field with you, Aaron. So you want to tell us a little bit more about your role and maybe give us a preview of some of the insects that you might talk about?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I work with pests, I work with insects and pathogens that cause disease that are attacking fruits and vegetables. And specifically, you grow something, these are the things that are going to reduce what you can get to market. And so we've been really interested in, especially in blackberries and other crops, and looking at things like mites, like broad mite, or other things that cause somewhat of a fruit quality issue, right? The berry looks good, you sell it, and it's not, like spotted wing Drosophila, which are little wee worms that get in your fruit. And so we've done a lot of research to help growers mitigate these issues. And so when you start thinking about tunnels, there's always this question of, what are you mitigating? We would call it a form of cultural control. How do you change up the environment to help limit pests? But it's not always the case, and so that's kind of what I'm trying to cover here.
Nope, that's great. Well, we'll head back out to the field, and Aaron's going to tell us a little bit about what he's observed as far as how the shade structure and tunnels are impacting insects and diseases.
Hey, I'm Aaron Cato. I'm the Extension Specialist for Pest Management, and I'm happy to be out here today to talk about pest management in blackberries, and especially considering any changes or considerations that you have to take when using a tunnel. And so, pest differences are going to vary depending on your strategy in using tunnels. If you're using a tunnel for season extension or to be early, then you're going to change the environment, and this may change how pests like insects or pathogens that cause disease are going to be in the environment, because they are a function of heat. However, if you're using a tunnel structure, say, to just add shade or applying it later in the year, then that's really going to change up what impacts you may see. If you're putting the tunnel on a lot later in the year, say you're waiting until blackberries fruit are already on the plants, then we tend to see a lot less impact from these shade structures, especially if you are using something that's going to keep the temperature similar to what it would be in the ambient temperature. One impact you could still see, though, is from the removal of rainfall. So if it's a shade structure similar to like a hailcloth that lets rain through, then you would probably see very minimal differences in pest pressure, so insects or diseases impacting the fruit quality or the plant health. However, if it is something that is still covering the entire plants or not allowing rainfall through, then you could see some changes or shifts in the types of insects or pathogens that are attacking the plants. So first, let's talk a little bit about insect differences. So insects that attack blackberry are typically to be pretty few and far between. We have some pretty major pests like spotted wing Drosophila. I would not expect many changes from spotted wing Drosophila inside of these structures. If you're lowering the temperature, then you could increase your pressure a bit, because spotted wing doesn't really like to be very warm. It likes a cooler environment. It likes a little bit less light penetration into canopies, and so you could increase the pressure a bit, but I wouldn't expect it to be much different, and I would still treat it like you were in the field, which would require a weekly spray schedule and a lot of types of cultural control and a very diverse program to actually control them. Other insect pests I would expect to be very similar, but the problem is with shade structures is that or tunnels is that you could add some extra pests. Things like aphids or mites tend to do better in an environment that's more arid, so less rainfall. There are different types of entomopathogenic fungi that actually attack things like spider mites and potentially even things like broad mites. And so when you put a structure over that's shielding all of this rainfall, then we tend to see a bit more. The tunnels behind me, we haven't actually seen a huge uptick in broad mite, which is a problem in Arkansas, or spider mites, which we've seen the last few years in some of our more, prolonged droughts and more intense summers that we've seen recently. And we think that's because this structure is added on so late in the year. If this was added on earlier, trying to push the crop earlier, we would expect that missing a lot of those spring rains would cause a lot more mite pests. And so I would definitely keep an eye out for more aphids, more mites, more soft-bodied insects like mealybugs that like a more arid climate. For disease management, we would expect some diseases to be less of a problem and some to be more of an issue. So things that rely on rainfall to move around, like some of our leaf spot diseases, potentially things like anthracnose, you may be able to remove a lot of the pressure or some of the pressure from these diseases or pathogens impacting plants by removing that rainfall. However, if you're just putting it on late in the year, you're still going to see some level of buildup in the canopies of these plants. The entire year removal, maybe you would reduce it a more of a larger percent, but it's not something that we've really looked too heavily into. And the ones behind me, we have not seen much of an impact on different diseases. Some diseases may also be promoted in a more arid environment and tends to be more humid, things like powdery mildew and some of the other similar types of diseases, like maybe some of the rust or something like that like a more humid environment and can be moved around a lot through the wind. Other considerations that you may have in tunnels are how are you going to actually control these pests? So in the hay grove tunnels behind me, what we see is that some of the rows are actually, or in between the plants, actually need to be used for support structure. So it's very difficult to get a tractor down these rows. So you have to ask yourself, how are you going to spray both sides of the plant if you can't drive a tractor with the sprayer through those rows? So in the ones behind, they do have to skip a row and try to spray between. What I would tell you is that that's not an excellent strategy, and you should look for some way that you're able to get a row or either a sprayer that can get in between, even with those support structures. One common issue that we see is that whenever you reduce the amount of photo penetration or light penetration through the tunnel or shade cloth, you see a bit more growth on the plants as they're stretching to get closer to that light, right? And so what we see is that makes a more stuffy environment, a harder to penetrate environment with pesticides, and so it makes it harder to actually control the pests inside. So it may require more canopy management to kind of limit the amount of growth that you see. Things like spotted wing, spider mites, broad mites, all could be a bit worse in an environment with a denser canopy, especially things like broad mite and spotted wing Drosophila, because they really like more humidity inside the canopy. Other considerations are just how much water you have to use when you're making these applications of pesticides in the tunnel. I've talked to some growers in other states like California that use a lot of tunnels, and they actually have to increase the amount of carrier volume or your gallons per acre that you're applying because the canopy is a bit larger. And so the bigger the canopy you have, the more water you need to effectively cover those plants. And the last consideration I would say that you really should take when using some kind of shade structure or tunnel is look at your pesticide label and see, are the products that you may want to use actually labeled for that? There are cases where things are not labeled for high tunnel. Typically, they're not labeled for greenhouse production, and depending on your state, depending on the federal regulations at the time, it could be that a shade structure could get close to being called a greenhouse. In Arkansas, what we typically say is if there's no sides on it, you're in the field. If there's sides that you can't move, then it's a greenhouse application. And if you are using a greenhouse application, or the rules for a greenhouse application, then there are very few actual pesticides labeled for use. And so in total, what I would really advise for you is to continue to scout like you would in the field. Don't expect that you're going to reduce a lot of issues from pests, specifically pathogens and insects. The primary impact is going to be increasing fruit quality as you can reduce some of those late rains that cause things like botrytis gray mold. However, botrytis loves a high tunnel environment, and so really try to use a myriad of approaches with pest management and treat it just like you would in the field.
Aaron, thanks so much for those insights. You know, sometimes we think these tunnel environments are going to protect the crop and offer a lot of benefits, but obviously sometimes when you're protecting that crop, you're also protecting insects or diseases that can then kind of proliferate in that environment. So great insights.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important topics to discuss, particularly if you're thinking about getting into high tunnels. There's a lot of misconceptions out there that this is controlled ag, so once you move inside the tunnel, like, you're good to go and you don't have to worry about it, when actually the opposite is often true. So I've grown in high tunnels in a couple states in various climates, different crops, and I would have to say that mites have been my biggest headache. They can go from just a couple here to there to be out of control very, very quickly. And if you're not scouting very regularly and very often, you lose control of that pest very quickly inside of a high tunnel.
Right.
Yeah, and so mites is a great one because that's a very common issue inside of high tunnels. But Aaron, can you comment on your observations specifically at this farm site and the occurrence of spider mites on the blackberries?
Yeah, no, I think it kind of goes back to that question of how are you using tunnels, right? If it's a very controlled environment, mites are going to be your biggest issue. And here, you know, not quite as controlled. They're letting the plants be in the field for the most part, and then they're either adding shade or some type of plastic that's reducing the amount of light that's going in. And so since that structure has been added so late, I think that's why we really haven't seen a big impact from mites or from some of the other things that you would expect, like, you know, a good example of a disease that isn't going to be impacted as much by a tunnel or reduced is botrytis gray mold, where, a good example is like in western North Carolina, they're similar to us, similar diseases, but you go eastern North Carolina, you get coastal, more humid, warmer, and you see a lot more gray mold on blackberries. Well, that's what we generally see in tunnels and blackberries. But since at ABC they're adding it so late, they're actually getting benefit to reduce gray mold. It's reducing the injury from rainfall that allows the pathogen, the botrytis pathogen, to get into the fruit. Whereas if they added that structure, I would say maybe like in March or something like that, or February, to push the plant faster, I would think that the increased amount of humidity, which is causing the fruit to be more wet more often, is going to lead to more germination of the pathogen, more disease, and things like that. So,
and I hinted at this earlier in my video, like how you design that tunnel will have an impact on your disease as well. Because if you get one that's poorly designed, you'll have lower, like reduced airflow, and then you have higher humidity and more of that botrytis issue. So when you're picking your high tunnel, it's very important to know what one is going to work in our climate, and we have a high pressure climate, so making sure you design that tunnel appropriately.
Yeah, so make sure you look at Tanya's high tunnel production guide, because when we say pest management, we talk about integrated pest management, and one part of that is setting up the environment. And so oftentimes we go to tunnels and they're just kind of off on a bad foot because they just really didn't think of mites being an issue. And so choose the right tunnel based on Tanya's suggestions, and then, as you said earlier, scout. Be aware of what's in the field. Get out there early, especially if you want to do things more, organically, things like that. You need to be aware early on, because a lot of those control tactics, they've just got to happen sooner rather than later. Yeah. And then once you get far gone, we see it with your strawberries, we've seen it with tomatoes. There's really, even if you're a conventional producer, there's not much you can do.
There's no catching back up, like once they get out of control. And when we say out of control, one tunnel that we went in, we scouted, we found a couple of mites. By the following week, we didn't do anything because we were like, it's just a couple. By the following week, we had what we called New York style mites, because they were just levels like living on top of each other. The population had gotten so high within just like 10 days.
Yeah, so you have to be really diligent with that scouting. And that's, when you're a new grower and you are not even sure what you're supposed to be looking for, it can be a hard thing to learn. And so, Darren, do you have any recommendations for resources that growers can consult when they're trying to get a scouting program started and that will help them with, making decisions about pest management and IDing what may be going on?
Yeah, there's a lot to know out there. And so you're never going to memorize it all. And so I would say get familiar with like regional guidebooks on the crops that you're growing. If it's blackberries or other cane berries like raspberries, you want to look at the Southern Region Small Fruit Consortium, and they actually have IPM guides. So the Southeastern Caneberry Guide will get you really, directed in the right way of what potentially could be. What are the common issues people are dealing with? And then you can kind of look through that list whenever you do see something in your crop, and then say, okay, is this what I'm dealing with? And then you can kind of look more towards like pictorial guides, like the like apps, like the My IPM app for fruit. That's going to give you a similar list of things, but also give you pictures. And I know we talked about scouting with disease. You always want to be on the forefront. You want to react or act, not react a lot of the times, depending on the type of pathogen. So look at those guides. Have an idea of what you think is going to be necessary, but you're not going to get you the whole way. And so the next step is, all right, now what am I going to deal with in Arkansas, Northeast Arkansas, or Northwest Arkansas? And that's where talking to your county agent, talk with them to maybe discuss things with us, which is specialists, and that can really say, all right, you're not in a tunnel, probably don't have to worry that much about botrytis, but since you're adding that tunnel, we're going to recommend some different things based on those scouting guides.
Some great resources, and I think we're going to put some of those links in the chat, so if you're curious about any of them, you can check them out there. We're going to continue our discussion here. So we got to do our virtual field tour, learn a little bit about tunnels and shade structures for blackberry production here in Arkansas, but we would like to engage with you out in the audience. So please enter your questions into the Q&A, and we will try and get to as many of those as we're able to here in the next 10 minutes or so. So let's see what kind of questions we've had come in so far. All right, looks like we have a first question about irrigation, which is very appropriate for a virtual field tour focusing on conservation. I thought it was interesting that Matt Wilson commented that the majority of the irrigation on the farm is done with surface water. So they're really relying on rainfall to feed those systems and have water to feed the crop throughout the season. Tanya, can you tell us a little bit more about how the tunnels and the shade structures are impacting water needs for the blackberry crop?
Yeah, so high tunnels, because you're moving from field into the high tunnel, so you're going underneath that plastic structure. So you become 100% responsible for getting water to your plants because it's not going to get rain anymore. So making sure, I always tell people, if you're getting a high tunnel, you need to make sure you have irrigation thought of and in place before you build that tunnel, because nobody wants to go out and water your plants with like a 96-foot tunnel with a little
watering can.
Yeah, watering can or something. So having that in place, and it is strongly encouraged that you use drip irrigation systems inside of a high tunnel for very, very obvious reasons. There's disease management advantages to it. You can really, there's weed control management benefits for using drip irrigation. So we strongly encourage that. I think Matt referred to, they talked about using drip irrigation systems. So using that inside of the tunnel can definitely be a benefit. And if you set it up correctly, so you've thought through like what your emitter flow rate is, how far apart you're putting those emitters, and you're basing that type of information and those decisions off of your soil type and your crops that you're growing in there, then you can really dial in how much water those crops need, and you can really get very good water use efficiency inside of a high tunnel. Now, usually you're going to irrigate a little bit more because, again, you've cut off that rainwater and you're increased your temperature, so your plants are going to be transpiring a bit more. So you're going to irrigate, but you can really dial in how much you're going to irrigate in there if you get it all set up correctly.
Those great tips, kind of how we've talked about throughout today's presentation, that there's not really just a one-size-fits-all solution. You really have to make a lot of decisions that are really based off the crop you're growing and your site, and irrigation is no exception to that. Of course, in your high tunnel production guide, you have a really nice chapter on irrigation.
Yes.
So a lot of information there. And, you and I are actually working on some irrigation resources that will be coming out over the next year or two. So stay tuned for that information. And we'll try and put in the chat maybe a link to the UAEX Fruit and Vegetable blog where events and resources will be posted on irrigation.
Yeah, and take time to make sure you install that correctly. I was mentioning earlier, like I think about 1/3 of my calls when I go out to people's farms is to help them set up that drip irrigation system. People get really nervous about it. There's a lot of pieces and parts, but they're very easy to put in and get in. So If you have questions about that, give me a call. I will come out and help you
Absolutely.
piece it all
Yes.
together.
Yes, it's one of those things that once you have done it a few times, it becomes a lot easier to understand, but getting started sometimes can be difficult,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, there's a bit of a learning curve. But
And particularly, we haven't touched on this yet today, but especially a lot of fruit and vegetable systems, we then add fertigation to that system where we're able to inject fertilizer, which, you know, just further increases the efficiency of that system because you're really targeting nutrients right to the rooting zone. But then it also adds a step of complication. But again, your high tunnel production guide also has some recommendations there for that one.
And one thing I feel we should toss out, because we talked about NRCS programs earlier, and they'll do cost share with high tunnels. They'll also do a cost share with drip irrigation systems. So when you're applying for your high tunnel, go ahead and apply for a drip irrigation. They can help you cover that initial cost of setting that up as well, which is always helpful.
Absolutely. No, that's a great tip. Excellent. All right. It looks like we have another question that is related to, you know, within these systems and high tunnels in particular, it's a little bit different in terms of what equipment you might be able to get into the structure and what you might have to adapt to be able to manage pests and do other things inside of that tunnel. So can you, both of you, talk a little bit about specialized equipment that might be required inside of tunnels?
Yeah, no, I did mention it a little bit in my video, and you know, we've been blessed, as I said before, to do some research out at ABC. And one thing that a lot of our research is revolved around is this idea of if you're going to use a pesticide, right? You know, we use IPM. Pesticide's kind of like the last line of defense where you're using it because you have an outbreak of a pest like an insect. Then you want to make sure you're using it properly. You don't want to waste money. You don't want to waste this thing that you're using in the environment. So you want to make sure that it's targeted. And one struggle that a lot of berry growers and other vegetable and fruit growers have is getting it to the plant and getting it well covering the leaves and things like that. And so it's even more pertinent when we talk about mites. The amount of control you get on a mite is very much related to how well you can cover it. And so what I showed in that video was this idea that they have these large tunnel systems and they've actually put some of the structures in the middle of the rows. And I would always recommend for growers to spray both sides of the plant to make sure you're getting really good penetration of your spray material and also getting really good coverage of leaves. And that's not an uncommon thing that we saw at ABC. That is very common where you go and you look and there are some times where you can't drive down every row. And I mean, we were out in northwest United States in like the biggest blackberry growing region, and they were doing the exact same thing. And so you may put out a tunnel and convince yourself, well, I'm getting some increase of efficiency, so if I don't get as good a spray coverage, maybe it's fine. But what I will say is it's probably going to reduce your ability to control things like mites. And so thinking of some way you can either have the structure to where you're not reducing capacity to spray from both sides, or thinking of, you know, novel spray solutions. So I've seen in some regions they'll actually have sprayers will wrap around the sides, and so that way you only drive down one middle, but you're spraying from both sides. Like grape sprayers are like that a lot of times, and they're not always these crazy expensive things either. Sometimes they're a bit, you know, homemade is the way I would say. But you know, just like with your irrigation systems, there's a lot of learning and a lot of things you can accomplish. And so what I would say is when you're designing, thinking ahead of time on your tunnels, don't skimp on that part. Like there are things where you can cut costs, you can cut some of the what you were doing in the field, and I would not skimp on this idea of spraying from both sides. It's in a good year, maybe you won't see any problems, but whenever it's already dry outside and mites are a problem, and not spraying from both sides is going to be impossible to control them. And so I would think for equipment, try to think about how you're going to do that in the planning stages is what I would say.
And so when I first got into high tunnels, I was in northern Utah. So our disease pressure and insect pressure out there is much, much lower. Yeah. So my first introduction to high tunnel production in Arkansas, to say I was often losing control of like the pests was an understatement. And one thing that was like a game changer, because we had a much smaller tunnel than what we were looking at Arkansas Berry Company. So it was a single bay designed for vegetables, like much smaller. So fitting a tractor in there wasn't an option. And I know I'm calling it the wrong thing. I've always called it a backpack air blast sprayer, which I know is not what the actual name of it is.
Maybe a blower sprayer?
Blower sprayer, I don't know. But when we shifted from that, because we just had a pump sprayer before, and we shifted to that, and it was a game changer. We got much better control because we could get better coverage over all of our plants. And it was much faster. We could go in and spray the entire tunnel in just a few minutes. So that was a game changer for us. But another thing to consider when you're thinking about equipment and what you can get into a tunnel, different tunnel designs will accommodate different equipment. So think about what crop you're growing, what kind of equipment you want to use inside of that tunnel, and then design your tunnel accordingly so that if you want to get tractors in there, there are tunnel designs where you can better fit a tractor in there. If you're not worried about a tractor, maybe you don't have to worry about your tunnel height or width or anything. So you need to think about some of these things before you before you buy your tunnel and before you're putting plants in the ground, like what kind of equipment. Because we're starting to see more and more equipment designed for high tunnel production.
Yeah, I think that's a good conversation to have, because you start looking at a tunnel, what's going to cost X amount. I can get this amount of money out of it. And then if you really consider everything, well, if I'm going to have this much tunnel area, I can't really use a backpack sprayer. That's going to mean I got to buy a specialized tractor. I think you can really quickly maybe talk yourself out of sometimes expanding too quickly, because there are a lot of considerations that you want to make sure you go into it where success is more guaranteed. And so blower sprayers, tons of research out there showing that they really help a lot on small areas for sure.
And high tunnels, I always tell people they're the same as what you're doing in the field, but very different. So you got to think through all of these things.
Great. And it looks like we might have had one more question that has, we talked about blackberries for a long time today, and it's probably spurring a lot of people to want to eat some blackberries. And so we had a question about the feasibility of growing blackberries in your backyard. And of course, I always encourage every Arkansan to have a blackberry plant in their backyard because of the, huge impact that the University of Arkansas breeding program has had on blackberries globally. So anywhere in Arkansas, for sure, you can grow blackberries in your backyard very easily. They're, you only need one plant. You don't need to have multiple plants for cross-pollination. Depending on where you're at in the U.S., though, you do need to keep in mind that blackberries are a southern crop, so they don't like cool temperatures below about 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter. So if you're too far north, it can get complicated, though there might be some opportunities to maybe grow them in tunnels for protection on small scale in the backyard. So. I want to thank you all for joining us here today online, and also thank Matt Wilson and Tanya and Aaron for joining us here in the studio and for providing their expertise. Also want to thank the USDA NRCS for funding this project, and all our colleagues at the University of Arkansas System and Division of Agriculture, all the people behind the scenes that you didn't get to meet today, for their help in making this virtual field tour so successful. I want to thank all of you for joining us on this virtual field trip and on the use of protected structures in blackberry production in Arkansas. If you enjoyed this field tour, be on the lookout for future emails and social media posts for our upcoming virtual field trips in this series. Thanks so much for joining. Hope you all have a great day.
Thank you for joining us for the Soil and Water Conservation Virtual Field Trip. This broadcast is funded by NRCS and produced by the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture Cooperative Extension Service.